As the vast plateau became increasingly dry and water sources ceased to exist in the Arabian Desert or the Libyan Desert, members of the Neolithic tribes began to gather in villages in the middle of their lands, from which they made a living by herding livestock or farming in the Nile Valley. They continued to hunt on land and in the sea, both to save their domesticated livestock and to eliminate predatory wild animals and harmful aquatic animals, such as the sea buffalo, which were a constant threat to their lives. However, hunting was not considered a vital matter for them, but rather a secondary matter. In fact, these tribes became farmers in the true sense of the word. The Neolithic villages consisted of a number of separate huts, possibly surrounded by a fence made of stakes for protection. Villages from this era have been found in Marmada Bani Salama, and they are of two completely different types. Some resemble the huts of modern farmers, which are built in the middle of farms at the time. Harvest. The nest was composed of walls made of reeds, protected from collapse by pegs fixed in the ground. If the nest was built on all four sides, it was usually somewhat oval in shape. Sometimes, these nests took the form of an arched curtain, tightly closed on the side from which the wind blew, especially the southwest or north. There is no doubt that the presence of hearths in these nests, as well as the presence of pottery vessels, is clear evidence that they were used as human dwellings. Near these nests, oval-shaped walls were found, no larger than a meter by half a meter, surrounded by a wall no higher than half a meter. This suggests that no other building stood above them, and it is possible that they were used as grain storage. Silos. The walls of these silos were built of kneaded mud, stacked one on top of the other in an irregular pattern. The nest's surface was covered with a layer of kneaded mud. It was slightly dug out in the shape of a plate, and the lower part of it was equipped with a perforated vessel fixed in the ground to collect and drain water. The foundation of the nest was anchored to the ground at a depth of no more than 25 centimeters. In the most excellent nests, a sea buffalo's leg was fixed vertically to the inner wall, serving as a ladder for easy entry. Remains of mats were found on the roof of the nest. There is no doubt that these huts or nests were used as shelters by the ancient inhabitants of Marmada, who sought refuge from storms and rain and spent the night there when the cold weather became intense. Surprisingly, there are no traces of humans or any of the tools used in domestic life in these nests. The roofs of these low nests were made of thick, horizontal forest mats. In one case, two opposite poles were found in one of these nests. It is very likely that they were placed to accommodate animal skins for the roof. This may have been the first attempt to make a tent that could protect humans of this era from the bitter cold and the scorching heat. In the aforementioned village of Al-Omari, the nests were found in a circular shape, with a hearth in the middle. Near these nests were large baskets made of woven mats, covered with Nile silt, which were used as storage areas for grain. The Neolithic burials, like those at Marmada, were dug in the village itself, close to the huts. They were all dug in a special location, as was the case at Al-Omari and throughout Upper Egypt, near the village on the edge of the desert, far from the Nile floods. Each grave was oval-shaped, like a hut. The body was placed lying on its right side, usually in Upper Egypt villages. In Lower Egypt, it was placed on its right side, positioned so that the knees were drawn toward the chest in most cases. The face of the deceased was turned toward the dwellings. Sometimes, bodies were found lying on mats or wrapped in leather or mats. At Marmada Bani Salama, it was noted that the deceased's hand was placed near his mouth, and sometimes a finger was seen in his teeth. Grains of wheat were also found scattered in his hand or around his head. In some graves, ordinary utensils, a board for grinding decorative materials, and tools made of porcelain were found among their contents. These tombs were not surrounded by other buildings. This is in contrast to the village of Al-Omari, where graves were marked with several stones stacked on top of each other. Many of these tombs were used to bury more than one family member. In this case, a place in the grave was prepared for the new arrival by collecting the bones of the deceased and carefully placing them on one side of the grave. These funeral customs, which indicate that the people believed in an afterlife, are the only source we have of Neolithic beliefs. It is not unlikely that these Neolithic customs found in these tombs were the ones the ancient Egyptians followed and continued to follow throughout all eras of pharaonic history, with some improvements. As for their true religion, their gods, and their worship, we know absolutely nothing about them. This is natural, as writing was not yet known. It is surprising that the spirit of art in this era was almost non-existent. Perhaps the reason for this was that the people of this era were focused entirely on achieving practical things. They made pottery for their own benefit, not for decoration. Likewise, their jewelry, such as necklaces and bracelets made of bones or baked clay, was rare and simple and showed no artistic taste. However, despite the lack of artistic spirit among these people in the true sense, we find artistic elegance in some vessels and some spearheads, which heralded their readiness for the artistic taste that later developed in them. Since that era, we have seen some signs from which we can conclude that the civilization of the Nile Valley was divided into two distinct sections. The first section was confined to the Fayum and the Delta, and the second to Upper Egypt. The northern civilization group is distinguished by being older than the civilization of Upper Egypt and more advanced than the Bay Leaf civilization. It is in this group that appeared the luxurious, refined spearheads in the shape mentioned above. These spearheads and polished axes found in everywhere there are machines that characterize this era, and much evidence has been found in other research that proves this fact. None of the vast areas occupied by the inhabitants of Marmada Bani Salama can be compared to the settlements of Upper Egypt, even during the Naqada period. This suggests that civilization in Lower Egypt was more advanced and developed than in Upper Egypt. In Lower Egypt, people began raising and domesticating pigs, a practice unknown in Upper Egypt at the time. People in Lower Egypt frequently used round-rimmed vessels, a type of pottery that was rare in Upper Egypt. While Delta pottery was mostly red or black and often glazed, vessels made of black clay and decorated with white, as well as red vessels with a black rim, were unique to Upper Egypt. Prehistorians called the Neolithic civilization in Lower Egypt the Marmada city, after the most important site where artifacts from this era were found. The Upper Egyptian civilization is called the Tassian city, after the town of Deir Tassa, near Badari, where the oldest Egyptian artifacts from this era have been found to date. This town is distinguished by its excavations. Axes were found widely in its factories, while ornamental objects were scarce, limited to a few shells and beads made of bone or white limestone. It is noteworthy that between these two civilizations lies another civilization, the one found in Fayum. Essentially, it resembles the Lower Egyptian civilization, but it has some unique characteristics. For example, we find that the granaries were built on a high elevation far from the dwellings and clustered in one location. Furthermore, the Fayum cemeteries were not found in the village, as they were separated from it, as is the case in Upper Egypt.